Some people are unbelievably lucky in life. Everything just seems to fall in place for them. It all goes the right way every time. And sometimes the good fortune even seems to spill out over everyone around them. But then on the flip side, there seems to be the same issue. Some people just never seem destined to have a single ounce of luck. Nothing goes right, and even the slightest success in life is fought for tooth and nail, and even then, the short end of the stick comes up more often than not. Much like good luck, you can also see bad luck spread. But what about the rare instance where someone has such bad luck that the word curse enters into the conversation? Are curses actually real? Well, let's take a look at some of the still unexplained curses in media. Now, before we hit up the examples, let's take a look at exactly what a curse is. The dictionary defines it as a solemn utterance intended to invoke a supernatural power to inflict harm or punishment on someone or something. As an added note, the usage of the word was actually in its heyday in the 1800s before bottoming out in the 1990s. But it has since seen a resurgence. Its use is generally associated with magical sources and for the most part isn't widely believed. But the concept of a curse shows up in folklore in most societies, meaning that it seems to transcend the boundaries of a single religion or even continent. But in all historical beliefs of curses, one thing seems to reign above all. The curse is applied by a person or an entity in response to some sort of wrongdoing. And to top it off, the act of removing the curse is never as simple as righting a wrong, but instead involves a complex ritual or prayer. So, with all that in mind, if the following stories are in fact actual curses in action, it makes you wonder, exactly who did they piss off? Now, the first one on this list is Harry Nilsson. He was one of the most gifted singer-songwriters of his time and started working in the music industry in the early 60s before hitting his stride in the mid-70s. Now, he was regularly on the top 40s chart and was on Rolling Stone's list of the 100 greatest songwriters of all time, coming in at 62. Now, he also walked away with 2 Grammy Awards and was nominated for a slew more. He was also sometimes called the fifth Beatle, considering his close ties with the band. But the one thing that plagued Nilsson was the seemingly horrible luck that spilled over to his friends and family. Now, it all starts in 1970 with the band called Badfinger. They were an average band with their finances in turmoil. In a last-ditch effort to recover their losses, they released an album called No Dice in November of that year, with the single Without You. Now, it's widely considered an average song of no great importance, and with that, the band started to falter badly. Then Nilsson got his hands on the song. He covered it and turned it into a #1 hit almost instantly. Now, keep in mind, that was the only tie that Nilsson had to the band. Over the next 13 years, the members of Badfinger would slowly die off, 2 from suicide and 1 from natural causes. Now, that one sounds like it might be a bit of a stretch, but let's go a little bit further into Harry Nilsson's life. Next up is his flat. It's located at 12 Curzon Place in London. It had the part in the deaths of 2 people. Mama Cass, or Cass Elliot from the Mamas and the Papas, she stayed there while Nilsson was out of the country. And she died in his bathroom at the age of 32 to heart failure. And 4 years later, Keith Moon would meet his end by overdose in the very same flat. Another to fall victim to Nilsson was the lead singer for T-Rex, Mark Bolan. He was out with his girlfriend when they crashed their car and Bolan died at the scene. Now, Bolan and Nilsson had worked together on several different projects throughout the years. Also, Bruce Gary, original drummer for The Knack, died a tad young. Lymphoma, in fact, at the age of 56. Even John Lennon can be claimed as a possible tie to Nilsson, as they were close friends and Lennon was even a big fan of Nilsson's music. We all know how that ended. But there are other tenuous ties as well. Dino Martin played with Nilsson rather often and died in a plane crash in '87. Linda McCartney partied with Nilsson as well. She died of breast cancer in 1998. And probably the most recent, Chris Cornell, who took his own life in 2017, had just covered Nilsson's songs Jump Into the Fire and was released shortly after his death on a cover album called No One Sings Like You Anymore. And of course, the man himself. Nilsson had a heart attack in 1992 and died of heart failure 2 years later in '94. So it might be a good guess that Harry Nilsson was somehow cursed, but what about something a tad less tangible? Fleetwood Mac is thought to have a cursed position in their band. The original lineup was founded by guitarist Peter Green, drummer Mick Fleetwood, and guitarist Jeremy Spencer in 1967. Soon after, third guitarist Danny Kerwin joined, as well as Christine Perfect, or later known as McVie, and of course John McVie, and in 1974, Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks filled out the lineup. And while the stories about the relationships in the band are widely known, there is a much darker cloud that hangs over them. It all started in 1970. When founding guitarist Peter Green took too much acid and had to be admitted to the psych ward, which later turned into a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Jeremy Spencer took too much mescaline in 1971, went out to buy a magazine one night, and just never returned. Later, the band found that he had joined a sex cult called the Children of God. Oddly, in future interviews, he credited himself with the success of the band, saying that his prayers for the continued success factored heavily. Then, Danny Kerwin turned on the band in the middle of a show, was committed, and ended up homeless and died on the street. And just recently, former guitarist Bob Weston, who had taken over for Danny Kerwin, died of an aneurysm in 2012, and Bob Welsh, who took over for Jeremy Spencer, took his own life later in that same year. So, if for some reason you see an ad in the paper for a Fleetwood Mac guitarist position, perhaps you might want to stay clear. Someone should also probably check in on Lindsey Buckingham. There are many movies that have been labeled as cursed, but there are two that stand out the most. The Twilight Zone movie was released in 1983 and was a collection of 6 stories that were put together by a group of high-profile directors and producers. Not to mention, some of the biggest names in Hollywood were in this film. Now, the alleged curse began while shooting when one of the stunt helicopters crashed into a river, killing actor Vic Morrow, along with 2 Vietnamese child actors. Now, to add to the creepy factor, a legend says that in the years prior, Morrow had requested $1 million of insurance if he had to work around helicopters. Now, that was due to a vision, apparently, that he had that said he saw himself die in a helicopter crash. Now, that said, I did struggle to find any corroborating proof to that claim. Now, according to the original script, Morrow's final line in the movie was supposed to be, "I'll keep you safe, kids. I promise nothing will hurt you. I swear to God." This is what many people point to as proof of the curse, which I don't really see, but it is definitely creepy. And if you want to add to all this weirdness, one of the concept artists had included an early sketch that had a burnt-out helicopter in the middle of a river. Another movie that has had less than stellar luck has to be the Passion of the Christ movie. Not only did leading man Jim Caviezel get struck by lightning, but he also ended up with hypothermia, a dislocated shoulder, a major skin infection, as well as a missing hunk of flesh from the whipping scene. Oh, by the way, that lightning strike wasn't just the one. Caviezel was struck during the Sermon on the Mount, along with production assistant Michelini, who was also struck a second time later on for good measure, which brings the count of lightning strikes up to 3 on a single movie. Luckily, though, in this movie, not a single person died. That is, unless you count Mel Gibson's career. Now, it wouldn't be much of an episode on curses without at least one mention of juju, or as it's come to be known, voodoo. Jelly Roll Morton was born in 1890 as Ferdinand Joseph Lamoth. Now, he's widely considered the father of jazz, or at least the first arranger of a jazz song, which does kind of mean the same thing, but let's not get into that argument. Morton was known to brag about his stature as a musician, which caused a fair bit of resentment in the early days. Now, to add credence to this story, I guess, Morton was also one of the pioneers of using the diminished fifth in his music, also known as the Devil's Triad. Now, if you want to learn about that, I do actually have a video planned on the Devil's Triad and Satan in music in general, so get subscribed so you don't miss a thing. Anyways, Morton's story goes like this, and by the way, accuracy can totally not be verified. Morton's grandmother was apparently a practitioner of the dark art of voodoo, and apparently sold his soul to the devil as part of a black magic ritual. Then, when Morton was working at breaking into the music publishing business, one of his employees stole all of his sheet music and sold it to a rival firm. Morton then sacked the boy the night after, and the very next day, Morton walked into his office to find a strange powder sprinkled all around. At this point, he was convinced there was a curse on him, and his luck started to fail. And fail is an epic way to look at it. Shortly after, Morton was stabbed several times at a bar during a good old-fashioned fight, and due to being a black person in the 1930s, he didn't receive proper medical help. He was never physically healed from that fight, and would spend the rest of his life out of breath, and he was often ill. So what's a guy to do? Well, Morton went out to another voodoo practitioner to try to break his curse, and according to him, it actually worked. But when he was just hitting his stride as a musician, his old voodoo grandmother died. And according to the legend, Jelly Roll Morton went on record to say his time was limited. Apparently, he knew that his grandmother sold him out to the devil and figured that she was going to drag him down too. And lo and behold, within 2 months of his grandmother's death, he died at the age of 46 from asthma. So a person can be cursed, a physical spot in the band, possible, but what about a song? In 1933, a couple Hungarians released a song which had the translated name of "The World is Ending." Cheerful stuff, right? Now, the original was written about the despair of war and ended with a quiet prayer about people's sins. Then, when reworking the song for an English edition, the lyrics were altered to tell the story of a man despondent over the suicide of his girlfriend, and it was renamed Gloomy Sunday. Now, the legend says that as soon as it was released, authorities noticed a significant increase in the numbers of suicides, which led to an outright ban of the song for fear it was spreading some sort of melancholy that just couldn't be helped. But of course, it was considered a decent song, so other artists took it and covered it, most notably Billie Holiday in 1941. And the same legend says every time it was released by another artist, no matter who it was, it coincided with an uptick in suicides. Now, there are some problems with this story, since there is no actual proof of any of this. Now, that is due to a few reasons, though. First of all, the 30s in Hungary wasn't a fun time. War was on the horizon, and the threat of a German occupation was always an issue, which meant that record keeping wasn't exactly top priority. Also, if there was an uptick in suicides in 1930s Hungary, it probably had more to do with the aforementioned issues in the country. As for the latter versions, well, I'll let you be the judge. The song is brutally depressing, and I do kind of get it, but all that said, no, I'm not going to show you the song here. I need all the viewers I can get. And just a few other curses to let you in before I let you go. There's one called the Curse of the Ninth, which basically limited composers to 9 symphonies before they died. And if you look at the numbers, it does look really convincing. Many high-profile composers fell to this curse, most notably Beethoven. But the one thing that can bust the idea of a curse is definitive proof that debunks it. And for that, we just need to look at all the composers that have surpassed 9. And yeah, since I can't pronounce all of their names competently, I'm just going to ask that you take my word on it. For the record, there's a lot. In sticking with the 9 theme, there's also a curse associated with John Lennon and that number. Now, whether true or not, the number 9 did seem to follow him throughout his career. Think about it. He was born on the 9th of October. The Beatles were discovered on the 9th of November. Now, these may all sound like good things, but from here on out, it does get a tad darker. The Beatles broke up after 9 years, and despite him getting shot on the 8th of December, technically, when he was shot, it was already the 9th in Liverpool. And finally, the most tenuous of them all, the SNL curse. This one is pretty straightforward, but the legend is if you play on Saturday Night Live, your band is doomed. Some people say it all started with Ashley Simpson and her weird appearance, but those that truly believe it think it all started when Sinead O'Connor ripped up the picture of the Pope. Now, come to think of it, really didn't serve her all too well, did it? Cheers. Thanks for watching.